Hello folks, today we're going to be talking about conformity and obedience, two terms that come up in social psychology that are often misused. Later in the week we will be getting into the work of Ash and Milgram that basically is where we get our understanding of some of these ideas. In order to get to the research and how they did what they did and what it means, we first need to just understand conceptually what these two terms are about. With that in mind, let's launch into a brief discussion of what these words mean. First on our list is conformity. And when we're talking about conformity, up at the top, I'll get my highlighter going here, the definition of the word is listed right here. And I frankly like this definition a little bit better than the one that you have in your textbook. The definition says, the degree to which a group member changes their behavior or attitude to fit the views of the group. And behavior or attitude is important because I think when we're talking about conformity, it can be the way we act, but it can also be the way we think. So the way that we are changing our behavior or attitudes to fit the views of the group. An example down here in the circle gets at the idea that you are in some kind of group situation and people seem to be leaning a certain direction. So the question is, do you go along with the group? And in this case, go along and say, yes, I think Obama's doing the right thing. Or do you disagree? Question again is it better to be wrong with other people or to be correct and right, but by yourself? When we look at the work of Solomon Asch later in the week, we're going to find out that his research, at least, says quite a bit about the idea that human beings are more likely than they want to believe anyway, to conform to fit the views of the people they are with. Interesting thing about conformity is that people like to pretend as though they are individuals, and the reality might not be as convincing. The second concept here is obedience. And obedience is different from conformity in the sense that we might be changing our behavior or our thinking, but the reason that we're changing our behavior is different, or the reason we're changing our thinking is different. So the definition here says that obedience is an action of those who comply with authority. And comply with means go along with, do what they say, alter your behavior. And the reason that you are complying with the authority is because it is uncomfortable if you don't. So basically the scenario that I always think about here is if we're talking about a classroom situation and your teacher says, okay, class, take out your notes. We're going to start working on whatever. And you decide, I'm not in the mood to take notes today, so you don't get anything out. If I'm the teacher and I notice that you haven't done that, I might come over by your desk and give you a reminder that you should do that. Generally, actually, first what I would do is make eye contact and let you know that I noticed that you haven't done what I asked you to do. After the eye contact, if you still refuse to comply with my direction, then I will move over closer to you and maybe kind of make some motion like, hey, take out your notes. If you still don't comply, then I'm going to directly tell you, take out your notes. And as this escalates, at a certain point, there is discomfort. And generally, human beings don't like to be in that situation. Most of us are likely to buckle and cave in and do what the authority says because it doesn't feel good to be in that situation. Now, if you don't like the classroom example, you can think of a job situation. You can think about a situation with your parents. But ultimately, if we are talking about people changing their behavior in order to go along with or comply with what the authority wants, that is the definition of obedience. The person that does work on studying obedience is a guy named Stanley Milgram. We will definitely spend time this week talking about some of Milgram's research and how he did his work. Before we get to that, let's talk about Milgram's book, Obedience to Authority. By the way, if anybody likes to read, a fantastic book. But Milgram, in his research in this groundbreaking book comes up with 4 ways that we know behavior is either conformity or obedience. Basically, he's trying to differentiate between the two concepts, and that's what we're doing here today. So let's get into it. Milgram says that the way that you know you're talking about either conformity or obedience can be seen in terms of hierarchy, imitation, explicitness, and volunteerism. Let's take each of these piece by piece and work our way through. Uh, Milgram says that, sorry about that, Milgram says that conformity regulates behavior among those of equal status, where in obedience we're talking about someone always is higher up in the hierarchy. Someone has the right to prescribe behavior. So parents have more power than kids, teachers have more power than students, the boss has more power than the worker. So they have the right to tell that underling what to do. Oh, don't be offended that I'm calling you an underling. In conformity, we're talking about people who are more or less on the same footing, so neither person in a peer situation has the right to tell the other peer what to do. Okay, people have equal status. So when we're looking at a situation, if one person has more power, they're higher in the hierarchy, then we might be able to identify that as obedience instead of conformity. Number 2, in imitation, with conformity, we have a long word here, homogenization. It says conformity leads to homogenization of behavior. We all know the root, or sorry, the prefix homo means same, so homogeneous behavior means the same behavior. So conformity, we have behavior that looks very much like the behavior of others. Okay, it's imitation. In obedience, there's no imitation. If I'm a teacher and I tell you to take out your notes, I don't take out my notes generally. You comply without imitating me. Generally, the boss does something different than the worker. Okay? If the worker's been told by his boss to sweep the floor, the boss doesn't sweep as well. There's no imitation there. Number 3, in explicitness, Milgram says that within conformity, we have an implicit situation, meaning that the behavior or thought change seems to happen spontaneously, that it's implicit, unspoken, unwritten. The rules are generally not laid out or direct. So if I decide, hey, the cool look right now is to wear my pants so that the waist of my pants is somewhere sagging down below where my boxers are, I'm going to think and act as though that happened spontaneously, that I just decided that was a cool look. When we're talking about obedience, generally in that situation, the action is very explicitly stated. The boss says, you do this work. The teacher says, you do this job. The parent says, you clean your room. Okay, very explicit. It's stated out loud like a command. So one difference that we might notice is in terms of how explicit or implicit the behavior change is. If it's written, if it's spoken out loud, if it is stated, then we're talking obedience. If it is not, if it is implicit, if it's unwritten, now we're talking conformity. Last, volunteerism. In terms of obedience and conformity, this might be the one place that you see the most obvious differences. In conformity, people generally deny that conformity is happening. If I accuse somebody wearing their pants down low that the only reason they're doing that is that they're conforming to what other people are doing, they will likely pretend as though there's lots of reasons why you would wear your pants that way. And they might even get into explanations that have to do with fashion or style or why it's more comfortable or any number of things. I distinctly remember being a young person and participating in kind of foolish um, fashions that at the time I thought were perfectly reasonable and made tons of sense. Looking back, you know, the only reason I was doing it is because that was what was fashionable. I would have denied it at the time if you would have accused me of conformity. When we're talking about obedience, the key difference here is that people will generally embrace obedience as the reason for why they're doing what they're doing. If I accuse you of doing something that I think is wrong, you will likely say, well, he told me to do it. You will volunteer that information for me. You won't say, I did this on my own. You're going to say, well, I'm doing it because the teacher told me to or because my boss told me to. And that's going to be kind of a key thing once we get into Milgram's research. So when we put all of this together and we look at the differences between these two terms, conformity and obedience, we're talking about similar behavior in the sense that we are talking about behavior changes or thinking changes. But why we're changing our thinking or behavior, the roots of that behavior change is very different, whether it's coming from someone who would be considered a peer or someone who has authority over us. That concludes the brief discussion of conformity and obedience. Thanks for tuning in.